There are warnings of queues, delays and criminal gang activity at the UK's borders if Britain leaves the European Union without a deal. A report from the government watchdog, the National Audit Office, says complicated new border controls may not be ready by the end of March. Meanwhile, it's emerged the government will urge ferry and freight companies to plan alternative routes if a no-deal Brexit blocks cross-channel traffic. Here's our economics correspondent, Andy Verity.
This is how easily goods flow into and out of the country now. And this is what might happen to the M20, according to the government and the National Audit Office, if we get a no-deal Brexit next March. The government said if there's no deal, the border will be less than optimal. The priority at the UK's newly enforced borders will be traffic flow and security. But what does less than optimal mean? The National Audit Office's latest report says there's a risk that 11 out of 12 critical systems needed to manage the border won't be up to scratch by the day we exit the EU, the 29th of March, and infrastructure to track goods coming in and out won't be built before then. If the government concentrates on traffic flow and security and customs controls aren't enforced, organised criminals may exploit the weakness.
The risks and patterns of movement through the border won't change at day one. Over time, organised criminals could take advantage of any weaknesses in the regime that it perceives. That could mean that it is easier for goods to be smuggled into the country without paying the due customs duty. It could be easier for people to be trafficked into the country.
The government says it's recruiting around 600 Border Force officers. But the NAO points out that in the last 3 years, Border Force staff numbers have been cut by 7%. And it says there's a risk that new recruits can't be deployed before March. Andy Verity, BBC News.
Our correspondent Richard Lister is in Dover for us. And Richard, it's probably worth you giving us a sense of how busy Dover is on a typical day, first of all.
Yeah, well, I mean, this is Europe's busiest ferry port. You can see, as well as cars, there are lorries going through. 2.6 million lorries are processed here every year. 2.2 million cars and motorbikes, 80,000 coaches, more than 11 million people. So there is a huge turnover at this port every day. And this is, of course, just one of 113 major entry points to the UK. Altogether, there are something like 257 entry points when you count the smaller airports and smaller marinas and so on. So there is a huge infrastructure looking after the UK border, and at the moment nobody who works in that infrastructure has a clear idea of what's going to happen on April the 1st when the UK is no longer a part of the EU. If there's no withdrawal agreement in place, this NAO report says it will be businesses and people that rely on the smooth functioning of the border that will pay the price.
So what preparations are being made?
Well, the government says they've been working on the possibility of a no-deal Brexit for the past 2 years, and that robust contingency measures are being put in place to ensure that the border remains open. But as we heard from Andy Verity's piece, even the government admits that if there is no deal, no withdrawal deal, come the end of March next year, then the situation at the border will be suboptimal. Something of a sort of government Mandarin phrase which covers a multitude of sins. We don't really know what that means, and something the NAO makes very clear, we don't know what that looks like, but clearly it's not going to be good. The reports are that the Cabinet has been briefed that Dover could be running at between 12 and 25% of its capacity for up to 6 months if there's no deal in place. And clearly that would have huge knock-on effects for shippers, like the people sending these lorries off to Dover to go onto the continent, and for other firms that export throughout a variety of access points in the UK.
Richard Lister in Dover for now. Many thanks.